Awesome. Good morning, everyone. We're so glad to have you back for day 2 of our Let My People Go Interfaith Conference on Mass Incarceration. We know it's early, but we thank you for coming back with us this morning, and we know that you're going to be blessed. It's going to be a great program. We want to get right into it because our next guests have a presentation that is packed with a lot of information. The program the organization that we are inviting for our morning program is Connect, and that stands for Congregations Organized for a New Connecticut. And we love this program so much because their leader, Kristen Estabrook, or one of their board members rather, has been an integral part of our thought process and guidance from the very beginning. When we didn't have a program, when we didn't have a set schedule, she was one of the ones that helped us organize our thoughts. And I credit her for the fact that we're able to join here today. So there's going to be a presentation with about 6 others of their organization that will be giving us a presentation on their Clean Slate campaign. And they'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a moment. So we're going to have that presentation for the next hour from 10 to 11. Then we're going to have a break for about 15 minutes, 11 to 11:15, and then we'll have a presentation from Kevin Burton, Adventist historian, who will be giving us a presentation entitled Unmasking the Beast, Adventist Abolitionists and Their Fight Against Structural Racism in Antebellum America. So make sure you tune in for that. For those of you on the Zoom, the link for that presentation is going to be the same as the one you're on now. After Kevin Burns' presentation, we'll have a lunch break, and then you'll follow your schedule to get to the next Zoom link for the afternoon and evening programs. Before we get right into it, just want to take a moment to introduce Connect by sharing you a little bit more information about them. And as we pull that up, I just want to have everyone who's on the Zoom just quickly put in the chat where everyone's coming from. We know that we have an international audience today, so if you can just use your Q&A feature, just let us know where everyone's coming from this morning. I know yesterday we had people from as far as Romania to Brazil, other side of the United States, California, and so many other places. So if you're on just now, just go ahead and put in the chat where you're from. We have New Orleans, Washington State, Maryland, Hamden, Connecticut, Tennessee, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. We got a lot of people. So we just want to thank you all for coming out this morning. Let's get right into it. Let me just tell you a little bit more about Connect, and then we'll get them started. So Connect is a collective of churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, and civic organizations from New Haven and Fairfield counties, right here in Connecticut, representing more than 20,000 people from different races, faith backgrounds, and living in both cities and suburbs. They have joined together to take action on social and economic justice issues of common concern. Connect has made an impact on issues as varied as gun violence, health insurance rates, police reform, immigrants' rights, and more. So we are really excited for our program, and we're going to go ahead and hand it off to them. Just wanted to quickly mention and do a thank you. If you notice, we now have ASL interpretation. We got a contact, and we're so thankful for their willingness to provide this service for us. And just a reminder, we have Spanish interpretation and Portuguese interpretation as well. Simply click on the little globe at the bottom of your screen, and you'll find the information for that. So with that, we'll hand it over to Connect.
Good morning, all. Thank you very much for joining us and for the description of Connect. I'm just going to do a short agenda overview and have our participants introduce themselves very briefly. And then Phil will get right into this clean slate legislation. And I think many of you will find it helpful in your own areas. I want to just give you a heads up that I'm also the timekeeper for our group. So you may hear a chime at some point, and that's a signal to the our speakers that they have 30 seconds or a minute to finish up so we can stay on time. Kristen's going to be putting links in the chat. You're going to see some really good resources used, and those will be available to you. So as I said, Phil Kent, if you'd like to introduce yourself. You have to unmute.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Phil Kent. I'm a husband, I'm a father of three. I'm a member of Congregation Mishkan Israel in Hamden, Connecticut. I am an attorney of 20 years in civil litigation in New Haven. And for today, I'm a member of the strategy team of Connect and co-chair of our criminal justice team with Dr. Asti Jackson. I want to talk to you about Clean Slate, which is a campaign that we have here in Connecticut to automatically expunge the criminal record of people who largely were formerly incarcerated. And the way that works is it would automatically expunge those records for misdemeanors, all misdemeanors, and for lower level felonies, with a few exceptions. After people have been crime free for a set period of time, that's basically the legislation. But that whole concept for us, why do we do that, is rooted in racial justice. I don't think it's any surprise to anybody here that racism really pervades not only the criminal justice system, but basically all of the societal systems that we're a part of, whether it's housing or education, or the way people go about getting jobs, or other functions of government. And the way it works here with Connect is that we learn about our stories from the people who are members of our institutions that are member institutions here. We're an interfaith, diverse collection of about 35 different religious institutions in Connecticut, with about maybe 30,000 members in those various institutions. And so what we do is we end up having house meetings with our individuals. And in this case, the house meetings around the issues of Clean Slate started in early 2018 with almost 1,000 different people, asking them to share one story or experience that they had that is on their mind, something that's happening to them, to their community, to people that they love. And a lot of the things that kept coming up when we started working on this, were criminal justice issues. We decided to form a criminal justice reform team. And we also had been working within our congregations to discuss racial justice issues, especially internally between our mostly white congregations and congregations that were mostly people of color. And so many of our mostly white congregations, especially in the suburbs, started to do some homework really, and raise their own awareness of systemic racism within the criminal justice system. Part of that awareness was learning that in Connecticut, Black people are incarcerated at a rate of 9.4 times higher than white people are. Latinx people are incarcerated at a rate almost 4 times higher than white people. And that's not because people of color are committing crimes at a higher rate than white people. It's because of the racism that I mentioned that permeates every level of our criminal justice legal system. The impact of that is that you end up with this disparate level of incarceration for people of color, and that impact persists for decades to come. And that is what led us to getting to this point where we came up with the Clean Slate proposal. So the other things that we learned in this process were that there's somewhere between about 70 and 100 million Americans that have a criminal record, almost 1 in 3 people in the United States. We also know that 9 in 10 landlords use criminal background checks. We know that 4 in 5 employers use criminal background checks, and 3 out of 4 colleges use those background checks. And that means that the impact of a criminal record really hits people when it comes to stable housing, when it comes to good jobs, and when it comes to being able to further their education within the higher education system. The other thing that we know is that formerly incarcerated men, in particular, can expect to work 9 fewer weeks per year, and they will earn 40% less. So together, this amounts to an average overall loss of about $179,000 for that worker by the time they turn 50 years old. And so we ask ourselves, right, do we need clean slate here in Connecticut? And for us, of course, the other thing that we find out is there a process already in place, in Connecticut as there is in other places? And of course, the answer to that is yes. There's a board of pardons and paroles here in Connecticut. But that process is really broken for a lot of reasons. It can be costly, especially if somebody has to get an attorney to help them get through the process. It's confusing. It is now online, which sounds great, except for the fact that a lot of people have problems with access to technology and potentially with the technical skills to use that technology. It's a long application. It's also very invasive and requires applicants to remember and relive literally every detail of their convictions and the crimes that they may have committed, which were often decades old and can really be re-traumatizing for people. It's incredibly slow. At the current rate, there are literally hundreds of thousands of people in Connecticut that are eligible under the current system to apply for a pardon. And only about 2% of the people in Connecticut who are eligible are actually getting through the system. But for that system to work for all the people who are eligible to apply the way it is now would actually take 631 years for every eligible person to go through and get their pardon in this current system. And finally, it's incredibly subjective. You've got a 3-person panel. We've been to some of these hearings. We've seen the way that people are made to basically grovel in front of this panel, so that panel can then judge whether they are sufficiently, contrite about the things that they have done in the past, and make a decision in that moment as to how they feel about that person. So, for us, for all of those reasons, the ability to get jobs, the ability to get housing, the ability to go back to school cannot wait literally hundreds of years. People don't have the ability to do that, right? People need this kind of relief now. There are other states that have already passed clean slate laws. Pennsylvania and Utah have passed laws that include felonies. Michigan only fairly recently passed a clean slate bill that Pennsylvania and Utah only include misdemeanors, I believe. Michigan includes felonies now. So let me tell you just a little bit about how we've done things here in Connecticut with our clean slate campaign. As I mentioned, we started off with those House meetings. And once we decided on that issue, we went right into what we call research actions. We started meeting with a lot of people. And when we finally decided that clean slate was going to be, I'll tell you more about our process later, but when we decided that this is what we were going to do, we started to go down the path of building relationships with folks, and eventually got to an 800-person assembly with candidates who were running for governor in October of 2018. When we did that, we had, I think, 4 of the major candidates with us. We started getting them to commit to having clean slate as part of their proposals with the public. We then had a campaign kickoff in January of 2019 with about 250 people following that. Later that year, we started going to the public hearing. We got a bill together. We found a legislative champion in Senator Gary Winfield, and now with Representative Steve Staffstrom, who's the co-chair with Senator Winfield of the Judiciary Committee here in Connecticut. And we got clean slate to public hearing in March of 2019. Once we did that, we had people basically come and tell their stories. Some of the stories that we heard and some of the stories that you'll hear today, are the types of things that we would actually have people go to the legislature publicly telling their story at the public hearings so that people could understand the personal impact of a criminal record on the individuals that had to live with that. We held press conferences in 2018. We started up a clean slate pardon session with people who wanted to go through the pardon process as it currently exists so that we could work with them, help them work on their stories, frankly, and also help them get the pardons that they've been looking for oftentimes for many, many years. That campaign opened the door to a lot of yeses. We had a lot of votes that we knew we could count on, but we didn't quite get it across the finish line that year. So we came back and kicked off again in January 2020. And instead of having 250 people, we now had over 600 people in our second kickoff that year. So the point is, we've continued on. The COVID happened. I know we're about to switch over our next segment, but COVID happened, and we could not finish the bill in 2020. We are now back in 2021, going through the exact same process, meeting with legislators, and we have a bill that's about to drop in the next couple of, probably within the next week or so, followed by public hearings. So we're looking forward to that. And I think my time is up, so I will turn it to Dan, who I think is going to give you a testimony about his story.
Just before we start that, Dan, let me just give everyone else here an opportunity to introduce themselves briefly. And then I think the audience will really feel the power of this issue through the three testimonies we have. So why don't we go Dan, Darren, Stephen, and Robin. So Dan, just introduce yourself briefly.
I'm Dan. I'm from Ridgefield, Connecticut, and I currently live in Boulder, Colorado.
Thanks. Darren?
Darren from New Haven, Connecticut. I currently live in Waterbury, Connecticut.
Stephen?
Hi, my name is Stephen Doherty, and I currently reside in Killingworth, Connecticut, but originally hail from New London, Connecticut, and happy to be part of this today.
Thank you. Robin? You need to unmute yourself. Good.
Good morning. I'm Robin, and I am from Bridgeport, Connecticut, affiliated with Connect through my church home, Mount Airy Baptist Church, where Connect is very important, very much a part of our community, brought to us from our pastor, Anthony L. Bennett. Thank you. Namaste.
And I'll just say that I'm Maureen. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Maureen Lopes, live in the suburbs of New Haven, and are part of the New Haven Quaker meeting. So Dan, can you please tell us some of your story?
Sure. Can everyone hear me? Thumbs up. So I'm here to share a testimony, my experience with the Connecticut criminal legal system and living with a criminal record. I was first arrested when I was 18 for possession of drugs with intent to distribute, and I also had a loaded gun in my car. This came out of a series of bad decisions and spiraling through addiction and mental health struggles. After being bailed out by my parents, I went right back to my ways with my previous friend group and was arrested again a few months later. Eventually, I pleaded guilty to 3 felonies and was sentenced to 3 years suspended after 1. At age 19, I served 6 months at Manson Youth Institution, which is a level 4 young adult prison in Connecticut, before being released on parole. So for me, my incarceration was probably the most challenging experience of my life, both up until that time and in the 7 years that have passed since. However, due to the privileged circumstances I returned to, I've been spared a lot of the ongoing challenges that most returning citizens face. However, my felonies still show up in every background check performed, which has prevented me from getting several jobs, including a work-study position at my college. Despite all its challenges, being incarcerated changed me for the better, not because the criminal legal system worked necessarily in reforming me, but because being in close proximity to other incarcerated people and experiencing what that was like inspired me to do better in life and to invest in my future and take advantages of my opportunities. So I realized how privileged I was and still am to enjoy these opportunities. And despite my felony convictions and with lots of love and support from my family and communities, I was able to attend and graduate college this past December. I graduated. So I aspire to go to law school. I want to be an advocate for folks who are in the position I once was in, and for those in even worse circumstances without my level of privilege that made it possible for me to get through it. However, a possibility I'm facing is that I could, attend and graduate from law school only to be rejected by the bar committee because I have a criminal record. And similar possibilities sort of loom over a lot of different professions that I could theoretically attend graduate school for. I've been lucky enough to find employment in my father's small business in Ridgefield and to have found an employer in Colorado where I'm currently living that saw through my record and gave me a chance. However, I would like to live unburdened by my record and be of greater benefit to the world. While I have the opportunity to apply for a pardon to have my criminal record expunged, and while I have a copy of the pardon application on my computer desktop, I feel overwhelmed every time I open it for some of the reasons that Phil mentioned. To recount my crimes and obtain original arrest reports, letters from parole and probation officers just seems daunting, and considering how traumatic those experiences were for me. Moreover, because I work and study full time, I simply have not found the time to even begin the 21-page application. This is why I think the Clean Slate bill should pass. The pardon application process is vastly too onerous and inaccessible, is therefore underutilized by most of those eligible. I've not been arrested since 2014, and I think this should be enough to prove that I'm rehabilitated and do not deserve to be marked for life as a felon. Nor do I believe that anyone deserves that. Anyone who has a criminal record and has remained crime-free. We're not defined by our pasts. It's time to shift the burden of proof and unburden those most marginalized by our criminal legal system. The Clean Slate bill can do this and can be a stepping stone to further investing in our futures in a more equitable world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. So fun to have you from Boulder, Colorado this morning. And now we're going to turn Darren Parker.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. In 2010, I was at an ex-girlfriend's house. She lives in East Haven, predominantly white city in Connecticut, in New Haven County. So she and I having a verbal dispute going back and forth. She called the police. They arrested me for disorderly conduct. At the station, the officers, they passed me a rotary phone over the service desk so that I could make one call. While I was on that phone call, it dropped. I started to dial again, but the officers hung up the phone saying they would give me a call later. So on my way back to the cell, 5 officers, all bigger than me, escorted me through a narrow hallway towards the cell block. Out of nowhere, one of the officers hit me with his metal baton in the small of my back, right, your sciatic nerve. And I dropped immediately. The pain was intense. And Malik Jones, young man from New Haven who was killed by East Haven officers a decade prior, flashed through my mind. I thought I was gonna die. One of the officers grabbed my arm, started to break his arm. Another grabbed my leg, shouted to break my leg. They pepper sprayed me in my eyes and my mouth. I could barely see, but I managed to wriggle out of their grip and run to the cell. The door was open. I ran in, closed the door. There's cameras all in the cell and cameras all in that back hallway. So the officers left me there without any medical attention for 18 hours. When the officer finally brought me to the hospital, I tried to tell hospital staff what happened. It was futile. I'm in handcuffs. I'm a criminal. The officer's word against mine. And so, you know, when an inmate goes to the hospital or prison or jail, it's required that a report is written. So in the report, the officers claim that I assaulted them. All these officers, if you ever get the opportunity to Google them, they were indicted by the feds. You can get pictures of them. These dudes are like big dudes. So when the case went before the judge, I'm in pain and the medication has my mind foggy. And I didn't have the wherewithal to stand up for myself. Even if I had, the judge wouldn't have believed me. In the end, I was charged with assault of 5 officers and sentenced to 6 months with 3 years probation. Now, if I really assaulted 5 officers, I never got 6 months prison time with 3 years probation. But in 2013, the feds investigated the East Haven Police Department for violence and corruption. All 5 of those officers that assaulted me were fired for misconduct, subsequently incarcerated in federal prison. Bullies with badges was the headlines. So I heard the news. Well, I seen the actual news. The when they announced that they had arrested guys, and they were arrested for assault, and they wouldn't be able to mistreat anyone else. But I was still on probation for this basic sentence, and even once that was done, the false record would remain. The prison system is credible deceit, racism within the legal system, and everything else, and so you don't. It's very hard to get justice. Myself, I've always been able to gain employment, but not always the employment I sought after. I've been turned down because of my record numerous times, but I remain diligent, and so I'm gainfully employed today.
Thank you, Darren. And I'm happy to say Darren has a new baby that
Oh
was
yeah,
left to me.
yeah,
Wonderful.
it's my guy, man.
Yeah. Thank you. And now Stephen will tell us something about his story.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephen Doherty, as I said before. And at the age of 18 months, I became a ward of the state of Connecticut. Foster care system, I will say this, that if you are born into the system, it is very hard to get out. And I was incarcerated in Summers Correction Prison in 1993. There was about, or thereabouts, standing on the bars in the upper tier waiting for a cell door to pop for rec. The no movement alarm sounded, and shortly thereafter, a lower door opened to the death row housing unit, allowing movement for Michael Ross to go to the medical unit. I was in the high security housing because of overcrowding. I was being sent to 7 days punitive segregation in an administrative segregation housing. So the mass incarceration and overcrowding has been an issue for many, many years now. This isn't just something that's recent. I've been convicted of many misdemeanor crimes as well as 2 robbery, second-degree charges, the beginning stage of my history. My criminal past is due to the use and abuse of drugs and alcohol, the onset of my childhood. I was released from prison in 2005 on my last robbery charge. That was 15 years ago. I am a devoted member of a 12-step recovery program. I've centered my life around helping people and helping them to change their lives. I have been fortunate enough to have been involved with the building of New Beginning recovery houses for men. I've also been the manager of several of these houses from the start. That has been the last 6 years to 7 years. New Haven is the location of these opportunities for men. I also volunteer on a regular basis for Habitat for Humanity and local soup kitchens, as well as many, many other organizations. I currently have begun to focus more on building of my own small home repair business. My contractor's license is restored. I still struggle financially. I am motivated through spiritual growth on Sundays in the church that I joined, First Congregational in Guilford, Connecticut, and also attend therapy sessions on a regular basis with someone who helped me look at life differently. My customer base is mostly others in the current circle of which I spoke. I am not judged but respected for my talent and drive. I'm sorry. My talent and drive. I continue to apply for work jobs for which I qualify only to be denied upon the background check. At age 26 years of age, I broke my back. Many have encouraged me to obtain disability benefits. I can't limit myself to this. I recently, along with others, began the task of the pardon process. About 6 years ago, I had a setback in my recovery and I fell short. Misunderstanding the guidelines for being eligible for the pardon, even with a pardon coach, I fell short about 4 months. Now I am currently eligible to continue with that application and and am in the process of doing so. And I'd like to thank you for the opportunity of being here and sharing my experience with you today.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I hope you've all really appreciated the courage that it takes for people to share these stories. And we're grateful for the time and their willingness to do it. We're going to shift some gears now and go back to Phil and include Robin for a segment we're calling Advocacy 101. And I already want to point out that in the chat, Kristen has put a link for more information about Clean Slate. But Phil and Robin are going to talk with you about what it takes to pull together a group of different congregations and focus on one particular priority in a given year. And Kristen's going to be showing you slides to go with this. So Phil and Robin, take it away.
Thank you for having me back. One of the questions you probably ask yourself is, what can you do about mass incarceration? And I've talked a little bit about how our campaign proceeded, and so what I'd like to do is take a look at the organizing chart that we have, so I can share that with you. And then I'm going to turn to Robin in a minute, and then we'll turn back to building a campaign. This type of work, if you want to get involved in changing policies, you need to build a coalition. You need to build a team. You need to follow what we call the organizing cycle. And we're going to go through this in a little bit of detail, but this chart is actually a very good representation of what that looks like. One of the first things you do in building your team is to identify leaders, and then to start to train them to work on the issue that's important to you. And by following this process, you already have a network, right? One of the things that you want to do is tap into your own network, start to build a reliable following, not only in your network, but in the network of those people who are within your network, whether the way we do it is through our religious communities and through other people that sort of tie in with our lives. Oftentimes, those are people who care about the same issues that you care about. And through that process of building that following, meeting with those individuals that are in your life and in your community, you'll identify leaders, you'll train leaders, and you will start to actually build a more formal sort of regional strategy team among the leaders that you find, and continue to build out your community and expand your network while you're going through this process. Part of that process, though, is getting to the issue that is important to you. And for that, I'd like to just, well, before I do that real quick, the point about the organizing cycle in many ways is that it's all about building power. How do you build power? You organize people. You also will organize money in some cases. Usually we say organized people plus organized money equals organized power. And it's about relationship building, but relationship building with a purpose, having meetings with a purpose behind them. It's not just, hey, I'm Phil, who are you? Tell me about yourself. I'll tell you about myself. We do all that because that's how you build a relationship, right? You try to find common ground, but you're doing it with a purpose. And you're also sort of mapping out. There are people in your life or in the lives of people that you know that have power already, right? Because of a position that they may hold. Maybe it's a legislator in your town, or a mayor, or your boss, or other people that you know. Maybe it's a clergy member in your community that you're close with, and they can help you to start building some of those relationships. So with that in mind, let me turn it over to Robin, who's going to tell you a little bit about herself just briefly, and then tell you how we engage these communities in listening sessions, and then building that community from there.
Okay, hi, and thank you for having me back. Like I mentioned before, I became connected with Connect through my home church, Mount Airy. It's very important issues regarding from my pastor. He's very adamant about taking part in Connect. And so how we started was through listening sessions, which we called house meetings. And this is a great way to get involved with your community, addressing issues that are of your concern. If you're looking for a way to start in your community and getting involved with Clean Slate, this is where you would do it, through your listening sessions, targeting those people who you know are going through similar situations regarding Clean Slate. You might have heard a story from someone, or you heard through another or read something about Clean Slate, or how someone is trying to start their life over. You would start here with your listening sessions. You would gather a core team where you would approach people that you know are concerned with these issues and talk to them about your concerns, and starting a listening session and gathering people with these concerns. You do want to make sure that when you approach these people that you are thinking about becoming part of your core team, that they understand that this is a commitment. It's not a one-time meeting, that it's going to take time. It is a process, but it is important, and you do get outcome from it if you are committed. Through that core team, when you have established those people that are committed, then you will reach out to others, like through your community, through your campus, through your church, wherever it may be. You want to have a gathering of a small amount. Since COVID is here, you may want to have an outside gathering where you gather your core team, and then reach out to other people who will come in. And through those core teams, you will have tables set up, and you will have all your supplies ready, paper, pencils, everything that you need to start your discussion on Clean Slate and hear issues. Encourage those people who are coming to take part in your listening session to share their stories, like the gentleman you heard today. They share their stories and concern that this is a major issue. And you will hear other issues and concerns with people. This is how we got to the point with Clean Slate. It was a major concern. And so you address the very most important concern at that time, and you present it, and you make it an issue. When you have breakout sessions within that listening session, And when you come back together and you hear the main concern, then you address that. Not saying that the other concerns are not as important, they will be addressed also, but you want to have one major concern that you're getting ready to address. And when you have that concern, that issue, the clean slate, that's where you begin to start your research. Get your information together. What's the outcome going to be of your campaign? Where is it going to benefit your community? You know, you're going to get all your documentation, everything together, because you're going to start to form your organization to take it to legislators and your mayors, whoever you are reaching out to get this issue, this concern addressed. You want to have all your documentation in order and presented so that you can show and you're expecting an outcome. Again, with these listening sessions, this is a very important part of Connect, because this is where it begins. This is where you find out the main concerns with your community and where you can make a difference. And you get your people to share their stories, encourage them that this is not a place where we're just trying to find out information about you, but we're really concerned. We're really going to try and help make a difference on this one concern that we're addressing now. And you will find that it does, in the number, we do get answers. We do get legislative passed. We do get our state representatives, our mayors, our governors involved and committed. When they see that we are committed and we mean what we say, you will get outcome out of it. And it is a tremendous way to get involved with your community and make a stand for something that is right and helps out the entire community. From hearing the gentlemen that shared today, I'm so proud of them for sharing and not letting society or situations in the past determine who they are now. Through clean slate, they can continue their walk and their path in life. And I really say thumbs up to you guys. And it's been an opportunity and to take part and connect. And again, make sure that when you address your legislators, that you have all of your information at hand and really let them know that you mean business. Phil?
Thank you, Robin. Yeah, I think I just want to emphasize a couple of things. First of all, it really is about building trust and relationships, right? I think that part is clear. It's about identifying leaders, and it's about having people share stories, as Robin said. And I just want to bring up our organizing chart once again, because this is a very cyclical process, right? You're constantly doing throughout this process each of these things. You're identifying leaders, you're training your leaders, you're teaching them about your issue, you're learning about your issue, you're building a team who can also build a reliable following, among their own networks. And if you look at the very middle of that chart, while all this is going on, especially with issues like clean slate and a lot of the issues that we deal with in organizing actions like this, we are very conscious and try to continue to learn about the impact and the relationship of race and class and power on what it is that we are doing or whatever the issue is. And it's incredibly important for an issue like clean slate, which we know from the things that I told you earlier are highly related to racial justice. The other thing I want to name is that when we get together assemblies of 600 people, not too long ago, we had an assembly of about 1,000 people. That demonstrates your power to those people that you are asking, those people who are in power that you are asking to change whatever policy it is that you're after. That shows that you can accomplish your goals, like passing clean slate, because you can get those people in a room and get them to essentially demand that their public officials deal with this issue in the way that they are asking that it be done. So as you're going along, once you've identified those issues, once you've done your research, right, as you're continuing to build your following, you get into those public actions where you gather 600, 800 people, whatever it is that you can build into that public action. And you then publicly ask those who are in power, whether it's a legislator, a governor, a mayor, a police chief, whoever it is that you need to make the commitment, you publicly ask them to make that commitment in front of those people. That, if you haven't seen it done, that is a very powerful step towards getting to your goal, right? In the case of legislation like Clean Slate, it's crucial that you know who your legislators are and that you understand the legislative process, because you need to be able to meet with those legislators and start educating them on the issue. You can't assume that they already know all the things that you know about your issue. And we've had to do that over and over again with Clean Slate over the course of the last 2.5 to 3 years. And then, of course, it's crucial to find a legislative champion as well, and then to work on, the nitty gritty of the proposed legislation for something like Clean Slate or another bill that you may want to put forward that's related to a criminal justice reform issue. And then you identify real people who are willing to share their stories. You help them work on their stories. You help them present those stories to legislators and other people in power and in the community. You build your vote count in support of your bill, and then you just keep going and going until you get that win. I think there's some stuff being put into the chat that you can investigate a little bit further about what we do. And then I just want to turn back to Robin briefly to give us a little bit of a step that we all can take, especially if we're in Connecticut or even if we're outside of Connecticut, things that we can do in terms of following through on our campaigns.
Phil, let me.
If we have time.
No, we're running. We want to make sure we have good time for Q&A. And Kristen's going to put more of those resources in chat.
Right.
So Robin, we will get that information covered. And I'm being fed questions now, so we're going to turn to Q&A. Which is always actually, let's see. If the time in prison does not prepare people to be better in their community, unless they have family and community to support them outside, how do we know ex-incarcerated people are recovered, trusted to be in places they are having a hard time to get in?
Okay. Do you want me to address that a little bit?
Yes, and maybe Stephen has some thoughts too.
Okay, so I'll try to be brief and then turn it to Stephen. What I can tell you is that there are studies that have been done and that are being done on people who have been expunged. So Michigan put out a study in 2019, and I don't want to kill you with statistics, but under that study, 94% of the people who had gotten expungement under the law there, they were not rearrested within a 5-year period for any crime at all. And 98% of people who had gotten expungement had not been arrested for any type of violent crime. So I can't tell you exactly, how but what I can say is that people who, it appears at least that people who are getting expungement, they are taking advantage. The vast majority of them, they want that second chance. It's very, very important to them, and they don't lose it by going back to committing crime. So I'll turn it over to Stephen. I know he had some thoughts.
Hi. So I kind of understood the question a little bit, and so I'm going to go with what part of the question I understood. So I happen to be one of those individuals who, in when I was in the system, I didn't have any family support or anything like that out on the street, you know. So when I was released from prison and back on in society, all my choices that I made were, you know, basically, you know, self-imposed. And you know, I've gotten to the point where I didn't want to, I wanted my life to change, and making bad choices, and and I needed to change the people that I was around, and so on and so forth. So when I come up for job interviews and things like that, my past shows up, but the person that's sitting before them is not the person that they see on paper. And it takes many, many years for you to get down the road from that before somebody even starts to view it in that aspect. And so, you know, the expungement and things that they'll talk about, you know, would be a great asset with a person such as myself. You know, I have limited resources, so to speak, and I chose to recover and become a better person, regardless of what somebody is going to do for me. You know, I need this for myself. You know, if I could get a pardon or an expungement, that'd be great. But you know what? If I don't get it, I'm still going to continue to do what I need to do for me to be better. You know, I hope I helped with that answer.
Thank you, Stephen. Another good question here. Why is the focus of record clearance on the type of crime? So we know in Connecticut, the discussion has been misdemeanors, what level of felonies and whatever, on the type of crime, rather than on individual rehabilitation. Many people who are involved in violent offenses have turned their lives around. Phil, you want to?
Yeah, let me jump in on that. You know, our ideal is to get to a point where clean slate will be something that's available to everybody. But you know, part of dealing with people in power and dealing with the politics is to understand, you know, not only the world as we want it to be, but also the world as it is. We talk about that a lot in organizing. And, you know, we think it's important to get that opportunity for everybody who is impacted by the justice system, and everybody who is trying to turn their life around. But we also have to deal with the political realities on the ground. We need a governor in Connecticut who's going to sign this bill. And it's been very, very made clear to us that, you know, clean slate in Connecticut is not going to pass if it addresses the highest level felonies in Connecticut right now. So frankly, you know, getting that door open and improving on the model of other states so that we become the leader in a model that we can show works, I think is a huge step towards getting to a point where clean slate is available to everybody. You know, and it's just something that we're going to have to continue to work on.
Phil, sort of as a follow-up, the question is, does clean slate restore voting privileges in Connecticut? I don't
Sure.
think we're waiting for that, right?
Well, yeah, it's not an either or. In Connecticut, my understanding is that while you are incarcerated, once you've been convicted and while you are incarcerated, you cannot vote. But once you have served your time, and this is a problem that many people don't quite understand. Once you've served your time and you are, you know, back out in your community, you can vote again. So that may be different in other states. And so it's not, you know, one size fits all for every state, but in Connecticut, you can vote again once you've served your time.
Okay. Next question, what are some of the biggest challenges Connect has had to deal with in putting the coalition together? You know, the Connect's been around now since 2011, I believe, growing over time.
Yeah, I don't want to monopolize all the answers, but from my perspective, one of the biggest challenges is, you know, we do well in Connect about finding and identifying leaders and getting people who really are committed, is the way, that Robin talked about, that are committed to this work. I think that, one of the toughest parts is getting people educated on the issue. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to continue to build and build out and strengthen that coalition. It takes a lot of dedication and a lot of time to talk to all the different stakeholders that are involved and to build those relationships. That's probably the biggest ongoing challenge, but that would be the central challenge of organizing work, no matter what you're doing, right? Or where you're doing it, is educating people, building those relationships, changing hearts and minds, really.
Great. Well, we're going to have to wrap up. And once again, we'd like to thank the sponsors and the organizers for this very important meeting. Thank you for inviting us, and we look forward to future collaborations.
Thank you all for having us.
I'm not on. Can you speak with me? All right. Awesome. So we just want to thank Connect again and all their board members and all the participants for really giving us a heartfelt view into the world of the mass incarceration system. We want to thank everyone who shared a personal story. We understand that that is an emotionally tough thing to do, but we thank you for your bravery in doing that, and we thank you for Miss Robin and her partner for their presentation and sharing with us a little bit more about how we can get involved in changing the legislation in our respective areas, in our respective jurisdictions. And we hope that you've learned a lot about what it takes to organize and what it takes to change the systems that be in our various locales. So again, we want to thank them for an amazing presentation, and we want to thank the Yale Divinity School for sponsoring Connect. And then we also want to just thank Connect personally for being with us from the beginning and helping us organize this conference. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take about a 15-minute break. The Zoom room is going to remain open for those 15 minutes, and then in 15 minutes we'll come back and we're going to hear a presentation from Kevin Burton. Again, he's an Adventist historian, and he's going to be talking about church involvement in the abolitionist movement in the early 1800s. The specific title of his talk is going to be Unmasking the Beast, Adventist Abolitionists and Their Fight Against Structural Racism. So you want to come back for that. Again, that's going to be in 11:15, and we will see you in a bit. How do I pan spotlight? Oh shoot.
Hello, welcome to our third session of the conference, our second session today. Excuse me, we're just working out a little detail here. Okay, making sure everything's ready. But thank you so much for your participation in this conference today. It has been just incredibly exciting and rewarding for me personally, and I'm so glad that we can share this from all around the world. So once again, we are just excited for everyone who is coming from around the world. And sorry, we're just getting some technical issues resolved. But okay.
Yeah, start again.
Okay, I'm going to start again. We had a little interpretation issue with the languages. I don't think you just heard what I said. So, welcome to our third session of Let My People Go, an interfaith conference on mass incarceration. We've had two amazing sessions so far, one last night with a wonderful panel of lawyers, and one this morning with congregations organized for a new Connecticut. Today, now, it is my pleasure to introduce Kevin Burton, who is a PhD candidate at Florida State University, concentrating his research on the history of race, apocalypticism, and politics and the state. He has lectured at Andrews University, developed a course for Griggs University, taught at Florida State University, and is currently an instructor in the History and Political Studies Department at Southern Adventist University. He has presented numerous academic papers at conferences and published several journal articles, academic book reviews, and encyclopedia entries. His PhD dissertation explores Adventist political involvement in the abolition movement. And just as Kevin gets ready to present, we want to again welcome people from around the world. This morning, we've already seen people checking in from Brazil, from India, from across the United States. And so I'd just like to encourage you again at this time to share in the Q&A feature where you're coming from. We are just so happy to see everyone here. And we will continue monitoring that. But at this time, I would like to welcome Kevin Burton to the stage.
All right. I hope that I'm able to be heard and that you guys can see me as well as my screen. It's an honor to be with you today and participate in this interfaith conference on mass incarceration, a very important issue for a long time, many decades now, in its current form, that is. So the presentation that I want to share with you today, I've titled Unmasking the Beast: Adventist Abolitionists and Their Fight Against Structural Racism in Antebellum America. And so to understand, we need to start with America in the 19th century. And so let's talk about America and its so-called manifest destiny. The concept of manifest destiny arises in the 1830s, really, and the term is first used of which we know in 1845, in the middle of the debate over whether or not Texas should be annexed as a new state, of course, as a new slave state. And so this is an important sort of aspect of understanding what America viewed, how America viewed itself, and how politicians and religious leaders and other kinds of leaders in America viewed their sort of calling and goal. It's intertwined with millennialism and this idea that it's ordained by God, and that we are supposed to help prepare the world for some sort of state of perfect bliss. And America has to be sort of the harbinger and the leader in this sort of project. And so eminent historian Daniel Walker Howe, he says this in his book, What Hath God Wrought? He says, almost all Americans regarded their country as an example and a harbinger of popular government to the rest of the world. And even non-church members found millennial expectations an appropriate metaphor for this destiny. This picture here by John Gast, this painting by John Gast, it was done in 1872, and yet it's a very good representation of antebellum America as well. The telegraph, of course, was invented in the 1840s, and you see the lady there, the woman there, holding the book, a school book in her hand, and carrying the telegraph lines in another. She is representing America itself. And this is sort of an example of manifest destiny. John Gast called this American progress, where you have Americans moving from east to west. And as they're doing so, they're charging forward, with covered wagon, but especially with the telegraph lines. And you see several trains in this picture, especially as you go on into the background there. And notice what you see. Everything, quote unquote, wild, everything native and untame, uncouth, un-American, all the things that need to be eradicated by this millennial manifest destiny, they are running in fear from the white man. And so this is, of course, a painting that people thought was a great representation. They were not trying to be critical. They thought that this project was good, and that chasing away wild animals, wild peoples, that they thought that was a good thing. So this is, of course, arising in the so-called Jacksonian era, where Andrew Jackson will be elected president. And one of the things that's important to know about him is that he is the one who brings in a new form of democracy, where all white men are going to be given the ability to vote. They used to have property restrictions before this, and so only upper class citizens were able to vote before that. And of course, that's only upper class white males. And his understanding of democracy was heavily dependent on majority rule. And of course, democracy even now is dependent upon this to a degree, but he had a specific understanding of this. He believed that majority rule was absolutely necessary to prevent moral decay. And who were the greatest threats? According to Jackson, minorities were the most dangerous threats. He understood them to be the quote unquote predatory portion of the community. They were dangerous parasites for Andrew Jackson, which is why he is the president who enacts the Indian Removal Act. He's also the president who appoints Roger B. Taney as to the Supreme Court, and Roger B. Taney is going to later go on and give the majority ruling for the infamous Dred Scott case, which will rule that Black people are not entitled to their rights in America and should not be considered American citizens. And he's also the one who implements the gag laws, or the gag laws are implemented during his presidency. And we'll talk more about gag laws, and I'll explain what they are in a little bit. But this is important to understand. He's coming on the scene shortly after the War of 1812. And Great Britain is considered to be a great enemy, perhaps the greatest enemy throughout the antebellum period. Americans are very concerned and worried, and there's constant threat of war with on the border of Canada with Great Britain. And yet Jackson himself will view minorities, racial minorities in particular, as a more dangerous threat than even Great Britain. And that's because they're subversive. They're an enemy from within rather than an enemy without. You can see an enemy without a lot easier than you can see an enemy within sometimes. And so historian Harry L. Watson aptly states that majority rule was thus no platitude in Jackson's day. He took this seriously. And let's be clear, this is all about whiteness. This is about protecting white majority rule. Jackson himself presents himself as the quote unquote man of the people. And you can see one of his election posters from his campaign in the 1830s. Actually, this is probably from the 1820s when he first ran. And you can see here, he's touted as the man of the people. And yet he made it quite clear he was only the man really of white men, because women were not granted the right to vote and equal rights. And of course, racial minorities were not either. People of color were definitely disbarred. And so one example, and we could give myriad of these, one example to sort of illustrate how whiteness was central to America's project is taking a look at a standard geography textbook from the mid-19th century and looking at one of the subheadings, one of the chapter headings for that book, which was this: the white race, the normal or typical race. That was Jacksonian America. Slavery is a huge part of this. And so we talk about mass incarceration during this conference. This is the first sort of example of mass incarceration, if you will, in American history. And if you have read Michelle Alexander's excellent book, The New Jim Crow, she makes a very eloquent case that mass incarceration is sort of there in slavery. It will morph into Jim Crow, and then it will morph into the thing that we now properly call mass incarceration, dealing with the war on drugs and crime, and everything since, especially the 80s and Ronald Reagan. But it begins with slavery, and you can see this GIF image. It's this animation, how it's showing how the spread of slavery is going from 1790 all the way up until 1860, and you can see it just taking over. And this gives a very bleak future of America. Slavery was giving no indication whatsoever that it was going to die or go away. And of course, we all know that it led to civil war. And the Civil War was directly fought over slavery. And people in the South who were trying to defend their states' rights, they are trying to defend those states' rights because they want the right for their states to allow slavery. So however you slice and dice it, it comes down to that. And of course, this is an institution where human beings are bought and sold. Husbands and wives are ripped apart and separated. Children are torn from their parents. Women, especially, are raped numerous times by their slave masters. There's, of course, numerous beatings and whippings and all sorts of manner of cruelty, and just the simple, more simple perhaps, but equally cruel ideas and notions that Black people are just necessarily inferior, not full human beings, not even considered legally full human beings, because when the country is founded, there's the so-called 3/5 clause, which specifies that Black people in the South that are slaves are only to be counted as 3/5 of a person. And the counting is significant, of course, because of elections and delegates and state representation and all this kind of stuff, which was based upon, all of that is based upon population. And so they don't even count Black people as full human beings. And there's a whole host of other ways that Black people are subjugated to the white man in antebellum America, especially. But also, I want you to understand the North is not exempt from prejudice and racism. In fact, it is thoroughly entrenched and structural. And this is the key thing that I want to stress here is we're talking about Adventists fighting against a structural problem. And by structural, we mean there are laws in place, in addition to common practices, all sorts of statutes, powers that be, the law officers and people in power who are going to be using, allowing their racism and so forth to guide their practices and so forth. And so this is what we mean by structural. Racism was thoroughly structural in America during the antebellum period, which should be very clear to us all. We need to understand that this has not gone away, of course, but it's merely changed and morphed in subsequent decades since this period. But Reinhard O. Johnson says this in his book on the Liberty Party about Blacks and suffrage. He's talking about how they don't really vote. They don't consider themselves to be part of the American political system because they don't really have the right to vote in the North. Pennsylvania had granted Black suffrage, but it actually had withdrawn that in the 1830s, I believe it was. And so really in the North, throughout the antebellum period, you only have 4 states that actually give Blacks unqualified, and of course we're talking about Black men, unqualified, unrestricted voting rights, and that's Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont, the 4 uppermost New England states. New York itself, even though abolitionism was strong in many places there, that doesn't mean it was popular, but nevertheless in New York itself, Blacks had property restrictions. So if you were Black, you had to have at least $300 worth of property, which includes land, and there were very few blacks in the state of New York who had that, probably about 50 or so. And so effectively, blacks did not have the right to vote in New York either. And so, and even those who had the right, there was the problem of if you go and try to vote in those 4 states that allow it, you might be disbarred because of local thugs who are going to keep you from going to the ballot box. People don't understand this, but voting in the 19th century until I think the late 1870s is a very public act. It's not private in any way like it is today. Every ticket had its own color, and you had to take your ballot with you to a very open space like the courthouse steps, for example, and drop it off in the ballot box. And so people could observe who you're voting for because of the color of the paper you're holding in your hand. And of course, they'll also note the color of your skin. And so this is a very difficult thing. And so blacks did not feel like in the North that they had the ability to participate. And in fact, legally, they didn't in most places. Richard Archer has written a book fairly recently called The Jim Crow North, and he's looking at New England and segregation. And of course, this is important to stress because Jim Crow is in fact a Northern invention. It will of course become much more thoroughly practiced in the South after the Civil War. However, after slavery is abolished in the North had to deal with black people in some manner. White people did not want them to be considered equal, and so they did it by establishing Jim Crow. And so here is another sweeping example. You've already seen the legal example that I talked about, but also schools are not available to blacks. Neither are well-paying jobs. They're non-existent. Transportation was segregated. They had the Jim Crow cars. They also had the paddy cars. Most people think that Irish people were white, but if you know anything about the history of race as a concept, then you know that white people were a very narrow group, and the Irish were not considered white until about the turn of the 20th century. And so the Irish are segregated as well as black people on train cars. Church attendants, church attendees are going to be separated so that even visiting African ministers are going to have to sit in distant black pews or in balconies. Black travelers are going to have to eat in kitchens rather than in dining rooms, and sleep in garrets, some back room on a floor, rather than in bedrooms. All that was abundant was humiliation and disdain, and compounding these troubles is the colonization society and its attempt to send free blacks to Africa. And this is an important point that I'm going to unpack in just a second here on colonization. We need to understand colonization and the abolitionists and how they're different. So most people who were white in America who cared anything about dealing with the slavery issue, they're going to approach it through the idea and lens of colonization. And colonization was basically a scheme hatched to try to send black people to Africa. They wanted to make America white. And so they didn't believe that blacks and whites could live together peacefully, and they didn't want them to, in fact. And so they tried to send them to Africa. What's important here, though, is to note that they actually targeted free black people more than they did slaves, even though they advertised themselves as trying to deal with the slavery issue. But even if they dealt with slaves, and even if they did free slaves, and they did, they freed several hundred, they compensated, oftentimes compensated the slave owners for their quote unquote property. But most of the people that they send to Africa were actually already free. And so it's not really a very honest or good endeavor to try to get rid of slavery in America. And abolitionists understand this. Abolitionists are different. They are not colonizationists. In fact, they are anti-colonizationists. And they are going to do basically two things. They're going to demand and advocate for the immediate and total abolition of slavery and equal rights for blacks. Now, these things are sort of ranked a little bit. The first of these was more important. Emancipation was the all-important goal. Equal rights was important as well, but it was definitely secondary to the ultimate object of liberating slaves. And even though abolitionists were far ahead of the majority of white people in America, they too could display their racism on hand. But nevertheless, their racism and their problems were far different than other people in the North, and especially people in the South. Because of the radicalness of this agenda, It was always very unpopular, and they remained a tiny minority. Abolitionists are going to be mobbed regularly in the North. And so only about 2% of Northerners are going to be abolitionists by about 1840. Though this percentage will rise, it becomes harder to gauge these statistics because anti-slavery societies start to disband after 1840 pretty rapidly. And but nevertheless, we know that it does increase as you march forward to the Civil War, and yet it never is going to get probably even close to 10%. I would imagine it will never really get much more above 8% if you're going to define abolitionism as we do. And in fact, the Liberty Party in 1844, their vote for president is only going to be just barely above 2%. And so they are the ones very committed to both of these projects, and those people are going to remain in a very small minority. Abolitionism is going to arise as an organized movement in the late 1820s, and they're doing so because a small number of white Americans are going to wake up and start to echo Black protest. Black people in America had been speaking out since they had been enslaved in this country, but white people had not ever, in any consistent way, understood the problem and actually realized that it was an issue that needed to be dealt with. And so you see three pictures here. William J. Watkins is important because he's a leading opponent of colonization, and he's helping white people realize that Black people don't want to go to Africa. They view it as dangerous. Many of the people who went die. It's not the land that they were born in. They don't know it. It's foreign to them, and they don't want to go there. And he in particular is very influential on converting William Lloyd Garrison to this understanding of abolition. And so they do this through constant dialogue. In fact, they both are living and staying in the same Quaker boarding house in the 1820s. Garrison is with a couple of other Black people as well. Watkins is a leading figure in that. And it's interesting to point out that later in the 1840s, William J. Watkins will become a Millerite. And we're going to be talking about the Millerites more in just a little bit. That's the Adventists we're talking about. Maria W. Stewart was also an early advocate. She's one of the first, she has the credit of being the first African-American woman to lecture publicly. That, of course, is based upon what we know from written record. She was an apocalyptic abolitionist, and she is warning white America that God is coming very soon. His second coming is coming very soon, and he is going to be judging pro-slavery Americans for mistreatment of Black people in particular. She doesn't provide a date for that event, but nevertheless, she recognizes and believes that the second coming is very soon and imminent. And apocalyptic abolitionist rhetoric like this is going to be adopted by William Lloyd Garrison. And abolitionists generally are going to be quite apocalyptic in their agenda. One of the most important things here that they emphasize is that slavery was a sin. And the thing is that simply that most Americans, especially in the South, but even in the North, they refuse to look at slavery as a sin. They may not have liked it in the North, but nevertheless, they wouldn't call it a sin. And that's important because when you're using apocalyptic rhetoric like this, you're saying that the judgment of God is coming very soon. And if slavery is a sin and supporting slavery is a sin, that means you are going to be damned in the judgment. And this is an era where that had a lot of currency. A lot of people were highly religious, and even non-church goers would look at this as a very scary kind of prospect. You don't want to be damned in the judgment. You don't want to burn forever in hell. And so this is huge. And this is the agenda of abolitionists, to promote slavery as a sin. And they are slowly going to do that, but they don't really succeed too well. And we'll talk about that more a little bit later. We have a few different kinds of abolitionists. There are the Garrisonians, people following Garrison. They tend to be anti-clerical. They're very critical of pastors and the clergy. Anti-sectarian as well, which means they're against denominations because the churches are the right arm of slave power. They're supporting it. They're disunionist, which means they're going to advocate after 1842 that the North secede from the South And of course, what led to the Civil War was the South seceding from the North. But they are using that as an agitation tactic to try to spur people to emancipate slaves. And so this kind of thing is what why we call them Christian anarchists. And that simply means that they are going to be loyal to God above loyal to man. And so if there are human laws, if the structures of the government of the country that you live in are contradicting the laws of God, then you are duty bound to disobey those human laws and so forth. And so as a result, Garrison advocates that you cannot vote. You cannot hold or participate in national fasts. All of these things cannot be done because the parties that exist, the Whigs and Democrats, are pro-slavery. And so you cannot do this. There are other abolitionists who disagree. The political abolitionists, for example, they actually advocate partisan politics as the best way to try to eradicate slavery. Many of them will stay loyal to the Whig and Democratic parties, and yet the majority of them are actually going to form third parties that are anti-slavery, the most important being the Liberty Party. The Liberty Party had two objectives: immediate emancipation of slavery and equal rights for blacks. That's it. No other platform, no other things on their platform. Some of these people who are political abolitionists, they could also be anti-clerical and anti-sectarian. That was very common, in fact. But also many of them are evangelicals who will remain in their churches. And so another group here that scholars talk about are the evangelical abolitionists, and they don't tend to be anti-clerical or anti-sectarian. They support the churches, even though they're upset with slavery in the churches. They're going to try to fight that from within the church rather than leaving the church and fighting it from the outside. And so that's another grouping there. A category that I'm introducing is apocalyptic abolitionism. And this is because of tactics. All of these groupings are based on tactics, and you shouldn't think of them as being rigid categories. There's lots of overlap. They're free-flowing. In fact, believe it or not, one person can fit into all of these categories at the same time because they might vote, but still like Garrison and still stay in their church and still talk about apocalypticism. But apocalyptic abolitionism really has at least three things, and it catches a wide variety of abolitionists here. People who are going to warn about God's immediate judgment on pro-slavery people. Some people, like the Millerites, are going to add to that. The Adventists are going to add to that God's second coming, which is associated with the second judgment or this judgment. But not all abolitionists are advocating for Christ's immediate second return. But nevertheless, they're going to be talking about a judgment from God that's very soon. And they're also going to view social activism as necessary to prepare you for the apocalypse or the millennium, whichever view that you held. So if you are going to be, you actually need to participate in social activism if you want to be a participant in heaven or the new earth or in the millennium. Otherwise, you are going to face the judgment. And so a lot of these people are going to come out of Babylon, as they say, because they associate even the Protestant churches with Babylon, and it's your duty to come out of them so that you're not partaking in Babylon's sins. We'll talk about that more too. So let's get into these Millerites that we're leading up to. First of all, you have to understand that abolitionism was absolutely central to the Second Advent movement, which begins with the Millerites, and it will lead to some denominations like the Advent Christian Church and the Seventh-day Adventists. And abolitionism was so central to this movement when it began, and throughout the antebellum period, that really it's becoming quite clear to me that the Adventist Church wouldn't have existed without the abolition movement. One of the main reasons for that is because this doctrine, this movement, whatever you want to call it, is spreading through abolitionist circles. I think the majority of Millerites were abolitionists, and that becomes clear from a variety of ways. But two that I want to share with you, or one that I want to share with you here, is shared space. So the headquarters of the Millerite movement were in Boston. This is where Joshua V. Himes, the sort of architect of Millerism, if you will, he is headquartered there in Boston. That's where he starts to publish and print all sorts of manners of things. And the Millerite headquarters there are also the headquarters of Dow and Jackson's anti-slavery press. And they are printing scores of things, books, tracts, leaflets, even job printing like receipts for people to pay for their Liberator subscription. They're doing all this kind of stuff for William Lloyd Garrison and Garrisonian abolitionists in the 1840s. They're a very prominent press. And so you can see numerous other periodicals that are anti-slavery that are also published in the same building. Office space is being shared with Millerites. And in fact, the majority of the people who are doing those periodicals are in fact Millerites themselves. And so what's clear from this is that what people call the grand center and radiating point of the Millerite movement, it actually was also Garrisonian space. It was a place where radical ideas of abolitionism, health reform, Christian unionism, non-resistance, women's rights, anti-capitalism, and socialism all flourish. And I'm sure many people are wanting me to unpack that and say, wait a second, anti-capitalism, socialism, what are we talking about? Simply put, yes, there were Millerites on the fringe of the movement who were socialists to the core. They reject money, the use of money, property, owning land, all these kinds of things, and they hold all things in common. They're utopian, and there's quite a number of them. There's several hundred of them, in fact. And so they share office space with Joshua V. Himes and the headquarters of the movement. And there's also periodicals edited by Millerites that are promoting Millerism, that are talking about women's rights, as well as anti-capitalism, and other things like abolition and health reform. All these things are intertwined, and I could really unpack that, and I will in my book. But we're short on time. By contrast, Millerite headquarters in New York City, which were derisively called the Vatican of Millerism. This is where Joshua V. Himes had his second office. New York City, of course, being the second most important place for the Millerite movement. This is a different sort of space than Boston. The offices are going to move several times between 1841 and 1845, but nevertheless, like Boston, they are going to be connected constantly with abolitionism, abolitionist presses, and other abolitionist publishers. And so the publishing firm that they're associated with very closely in New York City is Piercy and Reed. And they operate an anti-slavery press, but they're doing all of their publishing and printing for evangelical abolitionists and political abolitionists. People like Lewis Tappan, who lived in New York City. And so this is crucial. And so the Vatican of Millerism, unlike the headquarters in Boston, was a place where evangelical and political abolitionists interacted with, thrived, shared space with, and they promoted the radical ideas of anti-slavery. And yet they're not going to go to the degree of disunionism, non-resistance, Christian unionism, anti-capitalism, women's rights. They're not going to go to that degree. And so it's important to stress this, because when we look at Millerites, the Millerite movement encompasses all of these forms of abolitionists. And so they're not completely consistent in their views, and yet they have a base that they share, and that is that they are abolitionists for the most part. There are, of course, some who are not, but most of the ones, it seems, were. So let's talk about how they deal with this. They're living in an era where it's very clear that racism is a structural issue. And so they're trying to deal with and attack these laws that are in place that are keeping the structure alive. And so look at petitions. They signed lots of petitions. Anti-slavery petitioning, of course, was very risky. Abolitionism is not popular. And the petitioning is actually a very public affair. You're going around in public spaces to get signatures, but also many times these petitions are going to be published in newspapers, and all the names of the signers are going to be listed there. And so this could lead to serious issues, and it did many times, where there were consequences that people had to face because they signed these petitions. But one thing that's fascinating about petitions is that they're considered multi-authorship. Everyone who signs is virtually saying that they wrote the statement that's above. And so these documents give us a good insight into the political views of people who would not spend the time to write them down themselves. And this is significant because most Adventists were the common folk of the day, middle class or lower middle class or low class people. And so most of them didn't write their views down, but we can get a glimpse from these documents. And so I mentioned the gag laws earlier that were enacted under Jackson's administration. What those laws were, and they existed from 1836 to 1844, is they specified that slavery could not be discussed and criticized in Congress. So the subject was literally taboo. It was gagged. And so as a result, all the petitions that abolitionists are signing and submitting to Congress, they're not able to be read. And so this is part of the structural issue that they're facing in and of itself. Petitioning itself was an act against the structure because the structure said you cannot petition on this subject. And so you see abolitionists fighting against that. And it was, of course, a radical thing to do. Here we have a petition submitted to the legislature of the state of Maine, and they were requesting that Maine as a state protest against the federal government. And you have several Seventh-day Adventists or future Seventh-day Adventists sign this petition. But here we have Betsy and Elizabeth White. Betsy White is James White's mother, and Elizabeth is his oldest sister. And James White, of course, is one of the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and his wife was Ellen G. White, the prophet. And so very important people. And they're abolitionists petitioning for the abolition of the gag laws. Here you have Harry G. Buck and John Byington, two Seventh-day or future Seventh-day Adventist ministers. John Byington himself is going to become the first president of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. And they are petitioning here against Texas and Florida being brought in as new slave states. And they're also seeking that slavery be abolished in the District of Columbia. Next, we have a petition here from other future Seventh-day Adventists, Stockbridge and Louisa Halland, very close with James and Ellen White. In fact, they will raise the White's children for years while James and Ellen White are preaching across the country. And here they are signing a petition for the U.S. to recognize the independence of Haiti. And this is significant because Haiti is the only case in world history where slaves won their independence through a slave revolt. And so this happens around the turn of the 19th century, and they win their independence from France. Of course, they are Black slaves there in Haiti. And America will not recognize the independence of Haiti because they do not want to lead any kind of sanction, give any kind of sanction to slave revolts. But most importantly, it's because most Americans, almost all of them, believe that Black people were not capable of governing themselves. They literally did not have it within themselves to do that function. And so if you recognize Haiti as an independent nation, then you're challenging that preconceived idea that Black people can, in fact, rule themselves. And so they did not want to lend credence to that. And so you see numerous Adventists signing petitions for this kind of thing as well, which shows that they did recognize, these petitioners did recognize that Black people were, in fact, capable of governing themselves. You have petitions directly against Jim Crow segregation in transportation. Here's a petition from Joseph Bates, one of the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, against all railroad companies who have the Jim Crow car, who are going to separate them and eject white passengers who are protesting, because a lot of white abolitionists were protesters. They did sit-ins on trains, and they would be ejected along with Black people from these colored cars. They'll just kick them off. Black people, of course, will protest by sitting in the white section on trains, including Adventists like Jabez Campbell. And he's ejected and beat to a pulp because he is sitting in the white section of a train. Very shortly before he believed Christ was about to return too. And so they are petitioning against this as well. Probably the most, one of the most controversial petitions were against the interracial marriage laws, particularly in Massachusetts. Massachusetts specified legally that white people could not marry a Black person, a mulatto, or a Native American. And so abolitionists start to petition against those laws for them to be repealed. And initially, they do so, and it's just mostly white women, all women, and most of them are white petitioning for this. And so when this happens, the North as well as the South are outraged. And they start to get a propaganda campaign and saying that all of these white women just want to have sex with black men, which is why they are petitioning for this law to be abolished. And so you see pictures like this that are published and disseminated, where you see all these white women dancing with black men who are, of course, characterized with exaggerated features to where they look partially animal-like. And they call this an amalgamation waltz. And of course, they're all concerned here. Americans are all concerned and hateful of the abolitionists because they don't want black and white people to have sex. They don't want mixed race people. They don't want to water down the white race. And so this is huge. In response to this, men will join the fight. And so in the very next year, you'll see men, including Joseph Bates again, who is circulating petitions for the repeal of the interracial marriage laws. And several Adventists will sign these petitions, including Joseph Bates and his wife Prudence, who is also the vice president of the Fairhaven Anti-Slavery Society for Women, and then William Gifford, who was also active in the Underground Railroad at some point in his life as well. In addition to petitioning, the Adventists are involved in direct action. And so let's talk about John Augustus. I haven't talked about him before, but he's a very fascinating individual. And his story has some very strikingly similar echoes to the mass incarceration issue that we see today. So let's see what you think about him. John Augustus was a Boston bootmaker. He was a Millerite leader, involved in the Second Advent Association there, made lots of contributions to the movement financially as well as in his other activities. And he's also a very active social reformer, abolition, temperance, anti-prostitution, you name it, women's rights. He's into pacifism and non-resistance. He's a radical. He is not only going to attempt in his his life work, which he's known for, he's not going to only attempt to reform white criminals, but also black criminals as well. And he's also going to fight against the injustice that they face at the structural level with the prison system. And so he commences these reforms as a Millerite in 1841, and he's inspired to do so because of his belief of the forthcoming judgment and Advent and so forth. To understand the story, we have to talk about crime in Boston. Drunkenness is without question the most common crime, and you might even see some sort of similarities with how people treated drunkenness with how they treat drugs today, like crack, for example. Some estimates state that approximately 80% of criminals are incarcerated for drunkenness. Prostitution, and you can add fornication and other things that deal with sex, was also very widespread, and they were cracking down on that quite hard at this time. And even though white and black citizens, if we can use the word citizens, because blacks are not arguably considered citizens, they don't have the rights of citizens for sure. But nevertheless, blacks in Boston in particular, they're engaging in these illegal activities at the same rate. However, just like we see today, blacks are disproportionately incarcerated. Law officers target them more so than they do white people engaging in these crimes. So in Boston, blacks only comprise 1.5% of the total population, and yet they represent almost 10% of the people incarcerated in South Boston in the House of Correction. That's a major discrepancy. Minors as well. Children are treated like adults, and they are going to be imprisoned just like adults are. To understand the perspective here, in commenting on the work of John Augustus, the Boston Statesman is going to specify in July 1844, quote, "They, that is the criminals, were without friends or money, and a sentence to the House of Correction, a place of infamous punishment and associations, was their common doom. Once put on the House of Correction track, there was but little chance that they would ever get out of it, for the odor of rascality would so stick to them that it would be next to impossible for one of them to get back into industrious and well-regulated society." So in a similar way, like mass incarceration today traps people legally, economically, socially, into this rut where you cannot advance in society, you cannot become industrious, you cannot provide for your family. The same kind of problem was present in this era. John Augustus had a different perspective. He says, this is a quote from him, he says, let us, instead of degrading him, and he helped lots of women too, so don't think this is just gender specific, but he's talking about men specifically here. He says, let us, instead of degrading him by disgraceful punishment, build him up and restore him to his station in society, that he may provide for his family and particularly his children. So John Augustus wanted to actually reform. He actually recognizes, I believe, that the justice system in his day, like ours, did not exist to reform people. It existed primarily to keep ruling classes in power, which of course was white men. So here are some aspects of his view on the legal system. He recognizes that there are many prisoners who receive no justice whatsoever. Most of them are unfamiliar with the law. They're too poor to provide themselves with legal counsel. And so numerous of them are going to be incarcerated unjustly because they are in fact innocent. And he recognizes that many innocent people are incarcerated. He also recognizes that the law and the police officers themselves were very biased against certain prisoners due to their quote unquote external circumstances. And so he believed, and he advocates and says that it's necessary to quote, have the temple of justice watched. He actually advocated and did practice himself surveilling the courts as well as surveilling the prisons on his own to try to see if people were imprisoned unjustly, if they should be in fact freed, investigate their cases, and actually get them legal help. And so let's talk about what he actually does. He devoted several hours of every day to be present in court. And he actually was eventually granted permission to sit on the bench itself with the legal counsel. And he was able to question and talk with the people being tried for their various crimes. And he will spend hundreds and thousands of his own dollars, most of which is paid back to him, in fact, to bail these people out and try to help them reform. Okay, he does that for thousands of men and thousands of women throughout his since 1841, well into the 1850s. I don't have the full statistics of his work showed here. And he also does more than this. In addition to bailing them out, he provides them with housing. He found them employment. And he also helped them reform so that they would not go back into prison or be arrested again. In addition to this, he also spent many hours of every evening after dark in the most dangerous parts of the city seeking people he could assist before they were arrested. And we'll come back to that point in a little bit. But he housed a lot of these people in his own house when he's helping them reform. And in fact, he had as many as 15 criminals living in his house at a single time. And because of this, there are people who start to say he's running a brothel himself because he tended to have women in his home. And so one time a reporter goes to his house to visit and he made a joke and said, if these women happen to be dressed a little bit better and looked a little bit more pretty, then we might say that he is running a sultan's harem. But in fact, that was not the case because Augustus was not simply trying to free the most beautiful women, and he was not trying to have sex with them and all these kinds of things. That was just his antagonists. And so that's what's going on. And these people would check in with Augustus, and so they would constantly visit him in his home, and he would help guide them personally along their way to reform. In addition to some of the opposition I already shared, you have the police themselves, and even the municipal court who were going to really protest and try to work against Augustus. One of the reasons that the police officers were doing this is because they received a lockup fee and a mittimus fee. That's a fee to transport the prisoner to jail. They received fees for every person they locked up, both the lockup fee and the transport fee. In the 1840s, they're getting 52 cents plus the transport fees. And by 1852, has risen to 75 cents. And that's a significant amount of money. in this era. That's well more than a day's wages for the average working person, way over that. In fact, the average working salary, you're going to make about $1,000 if you're a middle-class worker in the 1840s. That's going to be your annual salary, about $1,000. So making 52 cents per every prisoner that you lock up, plus transport fees, and you're going to lock up dozens every day. Boy, you're going to be raking it in. And so whenever Augustus is bailing these people out, they are not getting those fees. And so they are going to spread rumors. The police are going to spread rumors about him. They're going to lead to all sorts of things that will lead to his bankruptcy, temporary bankruptcy for a while. And you'll also have some of them who antagonize other rascals to go around and target the criminals Augustus is trying to assist, to try to tempt them into committing another crime. And so that's what he faces against. That's what he's facing in his life. But nevertheless, that was his what he's known for in his life. Now, I mentioned that Augustus was also out at night, wandering the streets, looking for people that he could assist. Well, some of those people were a criminal of a different sort. They were fugitive slaves. John Augustus was involved in the Underground Railroad as well. And in fact, he was a member of the Committee of Safety for the Boston Committee of Vigilance. And if you know anything about the Underground Railroad, the Committees of Vigilance are the organizational structure of the Underground Railroad. So we don't know the actual details of what John Augustus did and who he helped and the risks that he took. But we know for sure that he's a leader in this society. And so he is directly engaged and involved. And he could have helped in a couple of ways. If he would have encountered a fugitive slave while he's out at night or even during the day looking for people to help, he would have definitely assisted them. But in addition to that, with his knowledge of the courts, he very well would have been an important person to have for legal counsel as well, even though he was just simply a bootmaker. There were, in fact, dozens of Adventists who were involved in the Underground Railroad. Some of the most famous, in fact, like William Still, the so-called father of the Underground Railroad. He was a lifelong Adventist, not a Seventh-day Adventist, but one who kept Sunday. Garrett Smith, who did keep the Seventh-day Sabbath, was a very well-known Underground Railroad operator. And Simeon S. Jocelyn as well, who I found, in fact, was a Millerite leader. And he was involved in the Underground Railroad in New York City. Well, Adventists are inspired to combat this aspect of the structures of racism because of the laws of the land. There's a 1793 fugitive slave law that says that Black people should be fugitive slaves should be captured and sent back south, and that's going to be vamped up to a significant degree in 1850 with the fugitive slave law that's passed. Well, Adventists looked at the Bible, and they said, "Well, look, it says here, God says, thou shalt not deliver to his master the servant which is escaped from his master unto thee." And you can read slave there, and in many translations read slave there. The slave, the servant, the fugitive shall dwell with thee, even among you, in that place which he shall choose in one of thy gates, where it liketh him best, and thou shalt not oppress him. And so they looked at this as God's fugitive slave law. And Ellen White herself, the prophet of Seventh-day Adventism, will say that she had seen in vision that God had instructed Adventists to disobey the fugitive slave law and to abide by the consequences in violation of this law. So Adventists were very much against this, and we see several of them involved in the Underground Railroad, including John Byington, who will become the first General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. He was an ardent abolitionist, active in the Underground Railroad, active in the Liberty Party. And here are some pictures of hiding places that he builds into some buildings that still survive in upstate New York, and some churches and so forth. And you can read more about him in Brian Strayer's biography that came out recently. We need to deal with some of the other ways that Adventists dealt with the structures of racism. So you can look and see how I mentioned that the churches, the evangelical churches in America, including the North, they would not condemn slavery as a sin. And here's a quote from John R. McKivigan in his book that we're not going to read because of time. But the simple point is that almost all major denominations in the North did not condemn slavery as a sin until the middle of the Civil War. And so they are not abolitionists, but Adventists are part of the ones who are, as a church, as a denomination. And so they work in abolitionism into their fundamental beliefs. the so-called three angels messages of Revelation 14, which is sort of the pillar and backbone of Adventist theology. And they work abolitionist arguments into this, starting with the first angel, which warns of the hour of judgment to come. And Adventists have looked back to William Miller and the Millerites and saying, well, this is the beginning of the fulfillment of this judgment hour message. Well, who is being judged? What's the warning being given? Miller himself says that the 7 last plagues of Revelation 16, they're going to be poured out on slaveholders in America, just like the 10 plagues had been poured out on slaveholders in Egypt. And so this is a crucial point, and many other people are going to echo this, including Ellen White herself. Miller doesn't originate this argument. In fact, one of the earliest people that I have seen who does this is Maria W. Stewart, who I mentioned to you at the beginning of this presentation. She makes the same argument, that the 7 last plagues are going to be poured out on pro-slavery America, just like the 10 plagues of Egypt. The second angel in Revelation 14 says that Babylon is fallen, and another angel in Revelation 18 says to come out of Babylon so that you don't partake in her sins. One of the sins listed in the chapter is that Babylon engages in selling slaves and the souls of men. And so as a result, Seventh-day Adventists and other Millerites are coming out of their Protestant churches, which they declare to be Babylon, in part because they are pro-slavery. Charles Fitch, one of the foremost advocates of this, will specify this here and say that you have to come out in part because of slavery. J.N. Andrews, a Seventh-day Adventist leader, will say the same thing. The very fact that the Protestant churches are the right arm of slave power identifies the Protestant church as part of Babylon with absolute certainty, he says. Ellen White will insist that once you're out of Babylon, you must stay out of Babylon. And so as pro-slavery sentiment is rising in the North, when you get closer to the Civil War, there are a few Adventists who rise out as pro-slavery as well. And Ellen White says they must be disfellowshipped so that they will not give the impression that anyone in our church walks or engages in those kinds of sins. The third angel is one of the most fascinating because this gets into America's view of the state. Adventist view of the American state. And so this angel warns not to receive the mark of the beast in its image. Well, what beast are we talking about in the image and so forth? You have to understand the doctrine of the two-horned beast of Revelation 13 to understand Adventist views on this. And you see a book here by J.N. Andrews where he links them together, the third angel's message and the two-horned beast. They recognized you had to talk about them together. Well, the two-horned beast was representative of the United States of America, according to Seventh-day Adventists. Why was it the case? According to the Bible, this beast has 2 horns, and it looks like an innocent lamb. And that's because those horns for Adventists represented civil liberty and religious liberty. And yet this beast actually is a dragon and speaks like a dragon because as a nation, at the structural level, it denies civil liberties to racial minorities and religious liberties to religious minorities. And you can see Adventists blasting America for the sins of slavery and not granting equal rights throughout numerous sources. Here's one from Uriah Smith in an epic poem where he writes, "Millions that groan beneath oppression's rod, beneath the sin-forged chains of slavery, robbed of their rights to brutes degraded down, and soul and body bound to others' will. Let their united cries and tears and groans that daily rise and call aloud on heaven, for vengeance answer, let the slave reply. O boasted land, O land of boasted freedom, thou hast given the lie to all thy loud professions, fair, of justice, liberty, and equal rights. And thou hast set a foul and heinous blot upon the sacred page of liberty. And whilst thou traffickest in the souls of men, thou hurlest defiance proud in the face of heaven, soon to be answered with avenging doom." That's his view. Other Adventists echo the same kinds of thing, and I can just simply gloss it for now. This will result in Adventist literature being banned from the South. Abolitionist literature had been banned from the South since the Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831 and Garrison launching the Liberator in that same year. And as you march closer to the Civil War, more and more people, postmasters and so forth, are going to become stricter in their surveillance, and they will ban Seventh-day Adventist literature as well as ministers from preaching the Adventist message down south because of this. In fact, Moses Hole, a Seventh-day Adventist minister, is going to be threatened with a $50 fine and 6 months in prison if he preaches on Seventh-day Adventism, distributes the literature, or condemns slavery. So this is crucial. It didn't, alas, stay this way. Adventism after the war began to increasingly and rapidly decline and became quite conservative when it came to race. It wasn't initially this way, but after Reconstruction ends, segregation will enter first in the South. You see Joseph Clark here. There's an article I've written on him on the Seventh-day Adventist Encyclopedia. Joseph Clark and his wife Sarah are going to go down to Texas and teach the freed people there as soon as Reconstruction ends, literally within days. And they are going to refuse to segregate. And yet they recognize that other Northerners are coming down south and becoming, quote, tinctured because of this, by this great goddess of caste, as he calls it. And so they will leave after 16 months there, and Adventists will slowly segregate more and more, and that will move up north. Arnabon Timps of Harlem Renaissance fame, he was a Seventh-day Adventist, and he stated this in 1950. This encapsulates it fairly well. And he lived at a crucial era because he knew many of these people who knew these pioneers, okay? And he says in their early years, Adventists were solid on the race question. They began to compromise to appease the South. They are doing so, they are still doing it, and they suffer as a result. Their younger Negro leaders are fighting at every turn for an abolition of segregation and dual standards. They are not satisfied with their progress, I gather, and I don't blame them. And so this is a huge aspect. There's other aspects as well. Adventists are going to change their interpretation of the two-horned beast. You can see it illustrated in this sort of timeline from the 1850s to the 1950s, where you move from this sort of fearsome, lion-like, gnarly-looking beast to an innocent, cute little lamb. Central to this is World War I, and the federal government is going to play a role in surveilling the church, and they are going to insist that Adventists change aspects of this teaching and doctrine because they don't think it's American enough. And I don't have time to get into the ins and outs of all of that, but it's a huge aspect. And so even the state plays a role. It's not a direct cause and effect where the state is literally just making us change and we do that. There's definite willingness on the Adventists to make this change themselves. And so you see that as a crucial aspect. And so the very doctrine that Adventists had been using to combat racial injustice, they are going to tame it. They're going to basically make that beast a unicorn and stop talking about civil injustices and only talk about religious liberty violations, particularly the Sunday law, the thing that really matters to Seventh-day Adventists. And so they virtually turn that two-horned beast into a unicorn. And Douglas Morgan has done a good job of illustrating that in his book, Adventism and the American Republic. You can check that out for yourself. It will be to the point where Seventh-day Adventists will be happy to participate in political activity and in marches in the 1960s and 70s for anything but the civil rights movement. Now, many Black Adventists did participate, and yes, even some radical white Seventh-day Adventists did participate in the civil rights movement. We do know that. And yet, as a church, as a majority, that was not the case. And so you see a picture here of a march of Adventists marching to ban cigarettes and tobacco. And we're very proud of this at the same time, but we would not do the same thing when it came to civil rights because, we can't get involved in quote unquote politics. Well, that ended up just being a mask for many Adventists here. And in order to conclude here, we need to understand the masked America and unmasking of America that the Seventh-day Adventist pioneers recognized. I began with this image of John Gast. We've kind of ended here with this image from Seventh-day Adventists. And I want you to notice a few things here. Most Americans are looking at American progress and symbolizing it with the telegraph lines and the trains. And it's symbolizing white people conquering from coast to coast in America, getting rid of all sort of wildness. Civilization is entering this country, and it's supposed to be this glorious manifest destiny where white people are in power and will rule. Well, notice how Seventh-day Adventists viewed these things and used the same symbols. In this picture here, which has been colorized by Jefferson Rodriguez, he's done a great job here. You see a train in the background, just like you see in John Gast's image. And you see telegraph lines going around that sea there. And yet Adventists are using these symbols as symbols of oppression, which is made quite clear with the beast, the lightning coming down from heaven, this beast symbolizing America, the United States, and two chains on its back legs, slavery attached to one and creeds attached to the other, the two emblems that they saw that represented those horns, civil liberty violations and religious liberty violations, encapsulated by those two things, creeds and slavery. This was drawn by Uriah Smith. You can see his initials there in the shadow of the back leg of this beast. And this is the significant point. Adventists in the antebellum period, both white and black, they recognized that America was masked, like you see here in John Gast's image. It looks so great. It looks so wonderful. But wonderful for whom? For white America, especially white men in America. Okay? And so that's the mask that's there. And that is still the mask that we live with today. And yet Adventists unmasked that because they said it's actually that beast, it looks like a lamb, but you have to pull back the sheep's clothing, folks, and expose the dragon. And that's what they did in a variety of ways. They tried to expose that beast for what it was and say, look, this is what America really is. How do we know that? Because of how we treat racial minorities and religious minorities. That unfortunately changed. We could talk more about that change, but that's the point that needs to be emphasized. That is a challenge to Seventh-day Adventists today, and hopefully for people who are not Seventh-day Adventists, you can find it very interesting, perhaps inspiring, and you can at least enjoy the creativity, if nothing else. So that's all I've got for you guys today, and I guess we'll close it with that. We've got to unmask the beast to move forward.
Go ahead. Oh.
Thank you so much, Professor Burton, for that fascinating presentation. I wish we could just spend a few more hours on this topic. We'll have to invite you back at some point to share more. You're providing some really great content. So thank you so much for that time. We also want to thank right now Dwight Hall at Yale for sponsoring this today's presentation. And we're about to break for lunch now, but before we do that, we have a few quick announcements. First of all, we've heard and seen a lot of really great content already this weekend, and we want to let you know we've had some requests for these resources, and we want to let all of you know that we will be compiling whatever we can, and we will be sharing that over the course of this weekend via email or perhaps posting it on Eventbrite. We're still working out those details, but we do want to make sure you all know that we will be trying to get as many of these resources to you as possible, because that is the ultimate purpose of this conference. Also, I want to announce something that is not in the schedule, but after talking, we've decided that it would be really great to have a time where audience members, everyone, can come together and get to meet each other and interact. So tonight, we want to invite you right after our final panel ends at 7:15 to join us in a Zoom meeting room. So instead of having this one-to-many, it will be a chance that everyone can talk and get to know each other. So we'll be sending out a link for that later this afternoon, as well as posting it in the chat during the meeting leading directly into that session. So please, if you have time, feel welcome to come on at 7:15 to meet other people from around the world and to talk about this issue. Yes, Pilo?
Awesome. So as Steve said, we're going to be breaking for lunch now, and we just want to give you a little bit of a highlight as to what's going to come right after lunch. So we are going to have two presentations. We're going to have a panel led by our own Guilherme de Souza, a former YDS alumni. And the title of that presentation, or that panel, excuse me, is going to be Religion in Prisons, Chaplaincy and Religious Liberty Advocacy. And we're going to have three distinguished guests. We have James Soni from Stanford University, Imam Salahuddin Mohammed from the New York Correctional Services, and then Bahia Mohammed, a professor at the African American Studies Department at Howard University. So distinguished guests, and you know that you're going to love it. After that, we have another YDS alum Herring Gaston, who's going to be giving a keynote presentation from 3:30 to 4:30. And he's going to be giving his own personal story, dealing with the prison system and his journey to still be an incredible individual. And he'll tell you just a little bit more about his story and how incredible of an individual he is, despite the fact that he went through the prison system. So you want to be in tune for that. Those of you on the YouTube, again, it's going to be the same link. It will be a slightly different video because we're going to start a new session. But if you go to the same link, you'll be able to get on. Those of you on the Zoom, if you're following the schedule that was sent to you, we sent another schedule either last night, you might have received it this morning. We're going to be on our third Zoom link. So we used the first one last night, using the second one for now. Then we're going to have a third one for this afternoon session. And just to give you a heads up, we'll use the fourth one for our evening final two panels for today. So just so you know about that. Again, we'll be returning back at what time, Stephen?
At 1:30
Okay, very good.
Eastern time.
1:30 Eastern time. We hope to see you all there. Invite your friends, share them the YouTube link, and get some food, get nourished, and come back for more awesome content. Have a great afternoon, everyone.